welcome everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your Thursday morning to be present for today's session on talking to kids and teens about grief and loss. This is our second session in a 7-part series called Living with Loss, Playing the Hand That You Are Dealt. And it is our hope, again, in FCS Extension, that these sessions will help you think about ways in which you can play your hand if you are living with loss and feeling grief. The next 5 sessions will take place on the next 5 Thursdays, also at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and they include next week, self-care nutrition by our nutrition team. On May 6th, we are going to talk about creative outlets for grief. On May 13th, we will talk about financial resiliency. On May 20th, we will talk about mental health, including suicide and substance use. On May 27th, we'll talk about self-care and outdoor physical activity, and that's how we'll wrap up this series as we launch into spring and summertime full-blown. And so now it is with great pleasure that I introduce today's speakers. We've got 2 folks today. We've got Dr. Kerri Ashurst. She is a senior extension specialist who has a lifetime exposure to and experience with extension. Not only was she a 4-H member herself, but her father served as the 4-H Youth Development Specialist for UK for over 30 years. So Kerri knows extension really well. Her work today supports military families as well as Kentucky's children, youth, and families at risk. She also works with families who are coping with major crises such as illness and death of a family member. And she works a lot with positive youth and young development, family and couple communication, and stress management as well. Dr. David Weisenhorn is our other speaker. He is also a senior extension specialist, but for parenting and child education. His training and background is in human development and family processes, paired with his military and professional experience as an individual and family therapist. He really has a unique understanding and a lot of expertise with helping families. Specifically, he focuses on family process, family protective factors, parenting, healthy communication, and a lot of his research even highlights protective factors against depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic experiences and stress. So both Drs. Ashurst and Weisenhorn are also proud parents of young children, and they know all about talking with kids, and that's what they are going to talk with us today. How do we talk to our kids and teens about grief and loss? So I'm happy to turn it over to both Drs. Kerri Ashurst and David Weisenhorn. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Amy. I appreciate that amazing introduction. I wish I could get that all the time. That would be great. I'm going to share. As Amy was talking about today, we are going to be talking about a topic that I think is one that we don't spend a lot of time on. And so I just want to thank everybody for being here and let you know that I am really honored to be able to have this conversation with you all, and hope that as we talk about loss, that while I think a lot of what I will focus on will be the death, the loss of a loved one, loss does incorporate a lot more. And right now, in this past year, 2020, loss could mean the loss of connection between our family and loved ones. It could be the loss of connection with friends. It could be the loss of the ability to celebrate big milestones or accomplishments that we've had in our lives. And all of those things bring about the grieving process. And so we will focus a lot on that. And while our society doesn't seem to embrace that very well, it can make it very uncomfortable for us to have those conversations. And so I want to encourage you that if this is feeling uncomfortable, if we talk today and it brings up some things that may not be topics that you particularly enjoy to talk about, I want to encourage you to stick with it and know that Kerri and I are going to talk about these topics because they're critical. They are a part of something that we all will experience in the human existence. We will experience loss and death and grief at some point in our life. And so I think they're vital and critical. Know that the information that we share today is research-based. So much of the research that we share, the information we share, has come from research articles. And what that means is that it's based on the general population. I also want to invite you, as Amy did, and I really appreciate that, Amy, that if you have questions or concerns or just want more clarification, or if something we say touches your heart and you just want to share how you're feeling about it in the moment, please do that. If you want to put it in the chat, if you're able to voice that, you're welcome to do that. Interruptions don't bother me. As Amy said, I've got 2 young children, so I'm constantly interrupted at home. So you would make me feel comfortable if you interrupted me. It wouldn't toss me off. And I also want to say that as we go, I really, my intent is that whatever I share today would be somewhat helpful to you or to someone else. So moving on, what I hope that you'll get from today, what Kerri and I have intended for our presentation to share, is that we will be able to identify what grief looks like in children and in teens, and also to understand things that we should avoid when working with children who are grieving or teens who are grieving.
And then the third part that David and I would really like to move toward is the part we don't always cover so well, right? We talk a lot about what grief and loss is and why it's so hard to talk about and everything, but we really want to help move you toward a helpful stance, a proactive stance on what some of those resources are out there that you might be able to share with others or use in your own life when you're experiencing grief or loss in your own life and your own families.
So I want to start with this picture. Many of you may recognize that this is one of many pictures taken from Arlington National Cemetery. And I'm curious, what are the responses or emotional or intellectual responses that you have when you see something, when you see this photo? I'll share with you, when I see it, I see something that reminds me of peace, I see order, and I see honor. And the reason I feel that way is because 20 years ago, I had the distinct privilege of serving the Army's ceremonial unit that was in the 3rd U.S. Infantry Old Guard here at Arlington National Cemetery. And on average, 7 days or 7 times a day, we would honor fallen veterans and soldiers who had the opportunity to be buried here. And during those 4 years that I was able to do these burial services, I learned that one's response to death is tied to so many variables. And we'll talk about what those variables are. But because it's tied to so many variables, I think it makes it one of, if not the most difficult experience that we face in our human existence. And so I, like children, are very much like adults. We vary in the way we respond to death. And so hopefully today we'll begin to shed some light on what we might be expecting for children who are experiencing grief.
David, a couple of other things that people said that they felt looking at that picture were things like sadness because of lives lost at a very young age. Mm. And then also respect.
Yeah, and those are extremely important. And I think that's key. Again, it kind of ties into those variables that we all feel a little bit at a time.
And Sheila just wrote one that really taps at my heart. She said, "Equality in death. Everyone has the same tombstone."
Yeah, there's some uniformity there. Yeah, for sure. It wasn't always the case at Arlington, but it is the case in the newer plots, for sure. So when we talk about what we're expecting, I think it's important to understand what we know about the grieving process. And some of you may recognize the name Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. She was a Swiss psychologist, or psychiatrist rather, who shared in 1969 her theory on the stages of grief. And it was in a book that she wrote called On Death and Dying. And those 5 stages that she talked about were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And while those are extremely helpful in understanding the process, I think it's important for us to know and to remember that the grieving process is unique to each person. It's influenced by a number of factors, and those can be age of the individual experiencing the grief, but also age of the individual who's gone on, who has died. Includes the temperament and personality of the individual who is left to grieve. It's the relationship that they had with the deceased, the relationship that they have with the surviving caregiver, the type of death that occurred, and so many more variables. When we look at the ways that we can expect, we need to know that it's not a linear process, and it's typically not a process that's the same across the board. It seems more of kind of a tumbling, if you want to think of grieving in that way. And so there's no definite timeline. So when we look at the first one, what we can expect for children and what research has shown is that children oftentimes do not even experience or express grief within the first year of a tragic accident or the loss of a loved one. But that doesn't mean down the road that there won't be some expression of this loss. It's also common in the first year for children to forego their verbal communication of the feelings, and you might begin to see more of their emotion through the art or their play. So that would be considered the invisible pain. Once they begin to see these reactions and begin to express that's more of this sporadic expression. And this is what we might sense in 1 minute they're feeling fine, and then the next minute they're not. An example of that might be a boy who's riding his bicycle and falls down and scrapes his knee, and then all of a sudden there's this outburst in anger that shows if dad was here, then maybe this wouldn't have happened, or if grandpa was here, this wouldn't have happened. And so while it seems unrelated, it can be the way in which young children are often processing that grief. And there's some research that indicates that the reason that they process that in such small chunks is because they're not able to handle the intensity a lot of times of that emotion. And a lot of that happens to do with the way in which they understand and the development of the brain at that point. There's a third way that we might experience or that children might be expected to experience this grief or the way they might show grief, and that's in this regrieving process. And the idea here with the regrieving process is that it's the way in which they process grief as they mature, and so that there's new understanding. And so as a child matures, they may begin to process that grief in different ways at different stages. So an example of this might be a young girl who maybe she loses her mother. As she gets older, she will then, maybe when she develops physically, she'll grieve. And then when she goes to her first date, there's a regrieving process there. And then when she goes to her prom or gets married, again, they're regrieving. So this idea that grief is something that happens over a long period of time.
And this grieving process, I think, is so important to remember for all of us, because we think of things like the stages that David talked about a few minutes ago with Kubler-Ross, and that we think sometimes things are linear, right? That it progresses from here to here to here with stages of grief, when it doesn't necessarily. And a good example of that can even be things like birthdays. And a friend of mine just posted this morning that it was the second birthday since her mother had died, and that she thought that the second one would be easier than the first one, and that she was wrong. And, I think, not only newly acquired skills and processes, but also new milestones, new anniversaries of things along the way can really trigger that regrief process as well.
Yeah, very well stated. There's also regressive behaviors that are typical in young children. And again, because of that experience, that loss, oftentimes they revert to what they were, the behaviors that are much younger than their age, bedwetting perhaps, or sucking their thumb, this separation anxiety or fear of being alone, or oftentimes doubting their own confidence. There may be even this desire to sleep again, to wanting to come and sleep in the parents' room. Remembering that younger children are more likely to have the bedwetting and the earlier regressive behaviors, but as that child ages, if there's a teen, it may be more of that anxiety or that fear of being alone. Just knowing that as they're able to verbally process, they'll begin to use that verbal language much more and less as in the behavior. So earlier, younger children will see more of that behavior-ish. And then the last one that we'll mention is this guilt. Again, young children, and Piaget would say that they're very egocentric in their early stages, and that children believe that everybody sees the world as they see the world. There can be a lot of guilt around young children, especially if there was a fight prior to a death, specifically if we're talking about a parent. The loss of a parent may be very difficult because there could have been a fight early on, or one in which the child remembers that they wish that parent wasn't here, or they wish that parent to be dead. There's this magical thinking that children have in some ways caused that death to occur. And so there is guilt, there may be guilt. This also is, and I think Kerri will mention this a little bit, but this also is tied into adults as well, parental parents that may have felt that if they didn't allow their child to attend a trip or get in the car, then that wouldn't have had the accident. And in some ways they believe that they could have prohibited the loss of that child. And so there's some guilt that might be carried with them. While that is not always healthy, it is a very common response. And so to expect that, if you see that, it's not uncommon that would be a response, but one that if left too long, there could be some psychological or disruption in that psychological well-being of that child or that adult. And so I know Kerri will talk when we get to that in these slides of ways in which we can help a child process some of this growth, but to expect it would be, to see it would be, again, a common response, I think.
Yeah, and David, we're talking predominantly about grief and loss from the standpoint of a death, but when you look at that list you just had up and you think about this past year and what we've all been through with the pandemic, and especially our children, every single one of those bullets, I can say I've seen every single one of those in my own child this past year in the midst of so much uncertainty and fear and helplessness. I've seen all of these things that you just talked about, because that has been a lot of losses all at once for us this past year.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kerri. I appreciate you bringing that up. And that's true. I think it's true, certainly, of my children. I think that I see the separation anxiety and the sporadic expressions of pain with again, just the loss of being able to not connect to their friends and not be able to celebrate some of those large milestones. So while we can understand some of the things that are common in the way that children respond, there's also some things that I want to note that are important for us as parents, as caregivers, as friends to avoid, and especially again with that younger age group. And that's just the language, just to be that we be careful with the language that you use and making sure that we avoid unclear or vague language. It's funny to me to see how much parents we find comfort, or we think we're doing good by saying things like, oh, they just passed on, or they're going to a better place, or no longer with us, because in some ways we hear that language and we think it's a little less scary, it's a little less definitive. But for children, that can be really confusing, and that's why we want to avoid that. Using simple language and clear, such as, grandma died, or grandpa's no longer living, he's no longer with us. It's important for children to understand that, because when we use language like passing on or going to a better place, it might create fear around a parent going out for the evening or going away for a weekend, and their fear that that parent might not return. So children need very clear and simple language. And I think that leads into the next point of we also want to avoid giving too much detail. We want to make sure it's age appropriate, in that we give very simple statements, and then we wait. Children are very wise, but again, simple in their understanding, and they process information at a much slower rate than adults do. And so when we provide information, we need to trust that children, and we can see this all the time, they ask and ask questions unsolicited, right? They are very curious about the world around them, and we can hear them ask questions oftentimes that we feel as adults are inappropriate, right? Because they might ask right as soon as they're feeling it. In so many ways, that's a really beneficial key to children, especially if they're dealing with the loss of a loved one, because they'll ask when they're ready for more information. And you'll see I put Apple example up there because I think for me a good mind picture is the way that my son eats an apple. And if you came to my house right now and looked at my fruit bowl that sits on my counter, you'll see at least one apple that has a couple of bites taken out of it. And somebody is probably thinking that's very unsanitary. And while I might agree with you, that just seems to be the way in which things work in my house. It might take my son 2 days to eat an apple, but he won't give up on that apple. And I think what's nice about that is it reminds me, I think in this instance, just how he does it. He might take a bite or 2 bites and then run around and come back and take another bite. Children are like that in the way that they understand and receive information and process information. When they want information, they'll come and ask you. So, to put this into an example might be to say, Grandma died yesterday. I'm sorry to have to share that news with you. And that child will hear that, and that might be all that they do. Hear that and walk away. They may ask a question, but typically they'll come back and they'll say, does that mean I can't see Grandma anymore? Or does that mean Grandma's not coming to our house? And that would be an answer you could give then. And then maybe they come back and say, well, why did the grandma die? How did she die? Those would be ways in which we can ensure when we give information to children that we're not overwhelming them, that we're not giving them more details than they can process, as we just start with, again, very clear and simple statements, and trust that children will come back and ask more of us when they're ready.
We had a comment on Facebook that I think is important to say right now. And that is that some kids who are in foster care feel this loss, even if their parents are not dead, they are gone from their life forever sometimes.
Yes, that is a very good point. Absolutely. It doesn't have to be death. That's good. I appreciate that reminder, and certainly apologize if in any way my language is not incorporating all of that. And I think that is why too, when we talk about the details, it's why it's important that we don't force children to talk or to participate in a funeral service against their will. Is that children are on their own timeline. Again, they're processing this information on their own. And so forcing a child, and oftentimes if children are taken to the therapy session, it's a lot of times the concern is within the parent that my child is not processing it at the speed or the rate at which I think is healthy for them. What happens a lot of times is that parent themselves is needing to do that. And so there's some fear around that. And that's rightfully so. It doesn't make anyone a bad parent. I think it actually shows that you care deeply about your children. But to be careful not to force, because we can push too hard on children and they might not have anything that they want to share at that moment. So making sure that we're not forcing them to talk about it. But if we are concerned about it, to be able to ask a question is fine. Like, would you like to talk about the loss of your parent, or the fact that you don't see grandpa anymore. Would you like to talk about that? And opening that door allows children the opportunity to know that you're trusted, and that when they want to talk about it, they'll know who to go to and have those conversations. When we talk about participation in a burial service or a funeral service, I certainly believe it's important for children to see our cultural values and how we celebrate end of life. And so I'm not saying you shouldn't take them to those, but if maybe there's an open casket or a wake, in not forcing a child to go there, and maybe even providing some information on what that might look like. When I'm from a German family, and I come from a very large family. And if you know anything about Germans, we're really loud, gregarious kind of people. And so when I remember the first funeral I attended was my grandfather's, and I was in kindergarten. And it was somewhat confusing, but at the same time, it seemed like a lot of fun. There were people crying, there were people celebrating, there were people laughing, there were people telling stories, sharing pictures. It was quite a commotion for a young child. And so being able to understand that, providing some information prior to that experience can be helpful, and to not confuse the child. Again, just being sure we're not confusing children. And then the last point I'll make here before I turn it over to Kerri is expecting a child to get over it. Again, when we started, we talked about this kind of a tumbling process, that the celebration of life or parents, or whether it's loss, terminal loss, or loss in the moment, or a celebration, this is a process. It's not anything broken. It's nothing that we need to fix or solve. It's just the way in which we understand and carry on. And Irvin Yalom, who is a existential psychologist, which means he studies the purpose of life and the end of life, and how people process that. He lost his wife to a battle with cancer. And one of the things he wrote about, that he said, is that it's not about getting over, but it's rather more like an amputation. You learn to adjust. And I think that was a really pretty way of putting the way we understand loss and dealing with it, is that it's nothing we'll ever get over, but it's ways that we learn to manage without that individual in processing that. So I hope that this has been helpful. And I think, Kerri, I want to turn it over to you as to next to show us or talk about ways in which that we can help.
Before we switch to Kerri, I have another comment from Facebook, and it's about children who have been adopted. They often feel sad because they think that their parents didn't want them, and so they experience that loss, even if it's, once again, not lost to death.
So very true, and so many different types of loss, and looking at loss from the lens of death and dying, but also looking at the lens of losses in our lives in general. And I'll tell you, David, if you wouldn't mind to go back to your prior slide just for a moment, a couple of things that I wanted to maybe bring up as points for conversation with all of us. One is just the idea of David saying, that children kind of take things in pieces, and it's hard to know how to not overdo it or try to focus too much on, am I saying too much? Am I asking too many questions? Am I forcing the issue? But then also showing how you are there, and how you are willing to talk about things can sometimes be the most important part for a child. And on an almost humorous note, my daughter recently said to me during an argument, she said, "Mommy," she said, "sometimes it stinks having a mental health person as a mom, because you ask me how I'm feeling too much." And I said, "Okay, touche." I said, "Thank you. I needed to hear that." And it was a little bit hard at first, because I want her to talk to me about her feelings when she's feeling grief and loss over things in her life. But at the same time, I needed to hear when I'm maybe overdoing it and forcing it a little too much. And one time that it happened more naturally was, as David said, walking into something like a visitation. I took her to a visitation for her first time when she was about 7, maybe. And she looked at me as we were walking out and she said, "Why were there people there that were laughing together?" She said, "Aren't they sad that someone died?" And I was able to use that then as an opportunity to talk about grief and loss in all forms in our lives, not just from death, but in all forms, can be a source of every emotion under the sun. You know, grief and loss can really be a roller coaster in many ways. And there can be really negative feelings and really awful depression and experiences that are bad with so many things with grief and loss. But there can also be so many positives that can come out of experiences that we have where we're grieving or we're losing something in our lives. And I think that's where we're going to move the conversation to now, is how we can help, but then also how we can help people to reframe grief and loss in their lives as well. So I'll go ahead and have you move to the next one. There we go. And so first and foremost, encouraging those expressions of feelings, letting a child or a youth know that you're there can be really, really important. But, you know, as I experienced just recently with my own daughter, sometimes when a child is saying, "You know what, I don't want to deal with this right now," saying, "Okay, I'm not going to force it." Not being afraid to show those emotions. I think, you know, sometimes as adults trying to work with children and youth who are experiencing loss, we feel like we need to be rather stoic and not break apart in front of them. But maybe sometimes that's exactly what they need to be able to see too, is see that we're feeling the pain with them, or that we're feeling the loss with them. And everybody grieves differently. Everybody in an individual family system, for example, is feeling the loss of a loved one in a different way. And we can't always be strong. We can't always hide our emotions by any means around children. And so, you know, being okay with showing some of that emotion and saying, "I feel this too, and I feel what you're feeling. I'm sad for you." Giving those reassurances, and again, bringing that back to some of the things that David said about feeling anger, hurt, feeling guilt, feeling like maybe I caused the death of somebody, and really, really reassuring a child that that is never, ever the case. That even if you and dad had an argument the last time you ever saw him, that it is not your fault that dad died. And, dealing with those reassurances along the way too, that have to do with other types of loss rather than just death, that can be a little bit more gray and difficult. And I know as a parent, we've all had very uncharted territory this past year when it comes to not even knowing what next week, next month is going to look like, but yet we were still trying to give reassurances to our children and our youth that things were going to be okay and that things were going to get better. It's hard at times. Maintaining the routines can be key for some of that, though, because as we're going through uncertain times in our lives, coping with multiple stressors, multiple losses, just going to bed at a certain time at night or eating at a certain time of the evening can really make a difference for children to know what's coming next at a time when they feel very helpless and don't know what is going on in their lives and what's coming next. And then certainly encouraging the supportive networks. And those can come in so many different forms and fashions. And I'm going to give you some resources here at the end of this. We're going to put some links into the chat box for you that you can use to be able to find some of those more formal support networks or localized support networks in Kentucky. But knowing that we are sitting at a place in our lives where we have more access to supportive networks than we've ever had before. You know, we often think about social media being such an awful place, and it certainly can be, especially if you go on and say, "I'm grieving a loss." And, you'll have many, many people who will come back to you and give you support and encouragement and good, kind words, but you'll also have people who can make some really callous responses along the way on social media. But at the same time, social media can be one of the best ways to connect to resources, to people, be it friends, peers, experts, others that are going through some of the same things, finding programs that are out there. We really are sitting at a place in history where there's more access to some of this than there ever has been before. And then the last thing that David and I included on this slide is just being aware, always being aware. all of us are coping with things. And even when we know someone well, a coworker or a sibling or a friend, it doesn't mean we know everything that they're going through. And even though we are dealing with a lot of our own things, just always trying to be mindful that everyone is going through something, and kindness, being kind and encouraging kids to see it the same way with other children in their lives too. Sometimes it's easy to get frustrated or put out with another child, but helping a child to see they may be going through some things at home or in their private lives that you know nothing about. Any comments or questions coming through right now, Mindy?
Not yet, Kerri. I don't see any on our end on the chat box.
Yeah, and I was talking to you and didn't have my mic unmuted. Yeah, I have nothing new on Facebook either. So I think we're good.
Okay. And if anybody would like to share a story or an experience, please feel free to chime in. As David said, interrupting is welcomed here to share some of those stories. Those stories matter, and those stories help to identify who we are and what we have been through. And that leads really nicely into this next slide, which has to do with, David's been talking up to now about the children and the youth in a family, but looking at the family as a system as they cope with grief and loss. Again, remembering that every member grieves differently. I cannot remember the name. Pauline Boss, I believe, was the name of the researcher that put a really amazing paper out and did a lot of research in the area called "We've all had the same loss. Why don't we experience the same grief?" And the idea behind that is just, for loss of a loved one, for example, that a teenage child in the family might have had a very different relationship with that loved one than maybe the parent. Maybe it was the sibling of a parent and the aunt of a child in the family, and that relationship might be different. That relationship might have been very complicated or strained with one person, but not with another. And that can really, really result in ripple effects going through a family system as well. And then just certainly remembering that when a child or a youth is grieving the loss of a loved one, that oftentimes their family members, their parents, their guardians, their significant others in their lives may be grieving at the same time. And it can be really, really hard to be there for someone else when you're also grieving at the same time. And that's where all of us can come in and be such welcome support systems for anybody, not just the children and youth, but the adults in a family as well, because we're not always able to be there for one another in a family system when we're all going through this. And as I mentioned before, just that idea of positive outcomes that can result. I know that's not always easy to think about, and our society usually doesn't look at it that way, right? Grief and loss is negative, negative, negative a lot of the time. But I actually focused for several years when I was working on my PhD on adolescent development in the midst of having a parent with terminal cancer. And my focus of all of the qualitative study that I did was looking at positive outcomes that these adolescents felt like they had gained as a result of having a parent going through the process of cancer with everything that entailed, and talking about it from a strengths perspective, looking at it from what are the positives I gained rather than the negatives that our family experienced. And it was really quite amazing what came out of some of those stories, and helping young people to be able to look at the positives and the strengths instead of the negatives. And, being able to see yourself as a survivor when you've been through any kind of a loss in your life, be it a death or a different type of loss, that you've gotten through, right? You've made it through the experience and you've survived it. You've gained new skills. You've become a different person. And I know for me, for example, with multiple losses I've had in my life, including loss of my father when I was young to cancer and losing a baby at 35 weeks pregnant, it was so hard at the time. And I didn't think I would ever come out of it a better person, but I did. I did come out of it a better person. It was just so very hard to see that at the time that I was going through it all. And, the coping skills that I gained, the deepening friendships and relationships that I gained out of the roughest times of my life, that again, it's hard to see the forest for the trees at the time that you're experiencing it and feeling it all. And then finally, helping grieving family members just to remember to care for themselves. That idea, and I know Amy loves to use this, and so Amy, I'm going to shamelessly steal your lovely analogy of being on an airplane and putting on your own oxygen mask first as an adult before you put on the oxygen mask of a child that's maybe with you. You know, that idea is caring for yourself, and if you're not caring for yourself, then you're not going to be able to care well for others. And sometimes you just can't, and that's okay. When you're feeling all the grief and loss of a death or a job or a pandemic or whatever it may be that you're feeling, that you may not be able to be there for someone else. And you've got to take that time to care for yourself, and that's okay. I think guilt comes in there to play a lot. And I think a lot of us that are even on this webinar today who work in the helping fields struggle with this one. I know I certainly do. I always want to be there for everyone else, and I sometimes don't do a good job of taking care of myself. But sometimes that can be the most important thing that we can do when we're experiencing grief and loss in our lives. And so I mentioned earlier some resources, so don't feel like you need to start trying to write these down with what you see on the screen. We will start to put these into the chat box for you over the next few minutes here before we finish. But I just wanted to point out what these are. First and foremost, local hospice chapters. If you've ever been involved with hospice, you know they're angels on this earth, and can really, really be there for a family who is coping with either the death of someone or the process of dying. That you know, they're there working with a family or a spouse or whoever it may be during that dying process as well. And that web link that I listed there is local hospice chapters throughout the state of Kentucky to be able to really help to make this more localized to you. Knowing where those are, knowing where the closest one is to you can really help with clientele that you might be working with. And one that we often don't really think about a lot when it comes to coping with grief and loss, and especially working with children and youth, is our public libraries. There are some libraries that have wonderful sections on grief and loss topics and very age-appropriate books. And some libraries that have even done a really good job with having an area right where those books and resources are located that's almost a little bit more of a meditation area, an area where you're off the beaten path from other people walking through a library and can maybe sit. But you can also certainly check books out, you know, books that you can bring home and read to younger children, or that you could give to a youth to be able to look at on their time and let them read it as they're ready. And again, using it as a way to find out what's out there and feel less alone. I see that Ashley posted on here, my local library ordered several books when I needed some to share with my stepdaughter who was grieving. And so that's you know, something else too. Not only are there resources there, but that they also can do a really good job at the libraries to order some things for you as well. So public libraries are really a hidden gem in many ways for wonderful resources that are out there. Also, grief programs and camps that exist. There's programs like Camp Echo that is done through hospice, and there are programs that are being done through a lot of different things throughout the state of Kentucky, such as Marquee. And even Amy and I have been involved working with a program that we've been helping to develop this past year that's going to focus on cancer diagnosis and coping after a cancer diagnosis, that can even involve a lot of anticipatory grief and fear and loss, feeling of loss in your life. Camp programs such as Camp Kesem. And we have a chapter here at the University of Kentucky that I work as the student advisor for. And so Kesem is a student-run organization that's located in multiple places all over the country that does camping programs for children who have a parent who is living with cancer or who has died from cancer. And it brings those children together to be able to meet others that are going through similar experiences. And we've had kids that have come to our Kentucky camps that have said this was the first time where I could talk about my mom and her cancer and not feel like other people were judging me or feeling uncomfortable. I could just be myself, and I could talk freely, and I could cry and share my emotions. And then finally, support groups. Griefshare.org is a wonderful resource, but they also have more localized sections of their website, as you can see there, where I actually broke it down into the Kentucky link for you to be able to go to and find support groups that exist out there, both in the form of in-person support groups and online support groups. And of course, over this past year, a lot of in-person support groups have maybe had to pause some of what they're doing in person or move it online and use things like Zoom. But a lot of good support resources that are out there to be able to bring you together with others who might even be close by, might be in your own community. So those are just a few resources that I have liked to use with some of my work along the way. David, I didn't know if maybe you have anything that you'd like to add to that list.
No, I would just encourage people to, like as you did, just to contact your local extension office and see what resources they have to provide locally for some of the if there's counseling or other areas, resources that you seek to have. The extension office is a great resource and can help out by locating other resources that can be helpful for you.
Yes, and I wondered if anyone who is attending this presentation with us today might know of a resource that's out there, especially maybe one that's even right here in a community in Kentucky that you might want to share, either in the chat box or by unmuting your microphone and sharing it.
One doesn't seem to be it. Well, that is all that we have for you all today. I'll look to Amy or Mindy to see if there are other comments or chats or questions that are coming in that are just comments that people want to mention.
One thing that just came through, David, was churches. Certainly churches can be one of the most critical places for support networks, for informal and formal support programs and groups and resources along the way.
Absolutely.
And someone posted something about Layla's. I'm not sure what that is. I'm sorry.
Oh, hey, Kerri,
Yes.
Can you hear me? It's
Yes.
Jeannie. No, I was thinking Leela, Leela Salisbury. What about her?
Oh, yes, yes. There is actually a lady who is working on building a grief center here in Fayette County right now. And so it's in the process of being built. There are, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 8 other grief centers around the country like this one. And she had helped with one in Georgia and has now moved here with family and is building a grief center here in Fayette County. So I believe that that is going to be a wonderful resource here coming in the near future in the Bluegrass area.
Someone on Facebook mentioned that Compassionate Friends are great sources of a resource. And I think that our speaker on Tuesday night really talked about how friends are great support. And so I encourage people to reach out to their friends and give them all the support that you possibly can.
Yes, Compassionate Friends is a wonderful, wonderful resource and organization. Someone else posted too, funeral homes often have information that's very helpful and it's usually free. Art therapy, oh yes, art therapy is a fantastic outlet for children, especially young children, I think, who are, well, not necessarily young, but any child who can express themselves maybe through art or writing rather than verbally as much. Verbal expression of those emotions can be really difficult. Mm-hmm. And Sheila commented that people have missed their churches and those relationships this past year. Yes, absolutely. And so that has really compounded so much of what people have been experiencing with grief and loss that is so difficult anyway, and in a society that's so uncomfortable with some of these topics anyway. And then the pandemic has resulted in a lot of that isolation and loss of the connection, at least in person, this past year.
There is a question there that I don't want us to miss for suggestions about helping youth process the losses of the past year. Mm-hmm. And then it goes along with what Vicki says about middle school students struggling with transitioning. to high school after not being able to be with peers during the past year. So maybe do you want to address those two together?
Yeah, David, have you worked on anything with
In ways in which I mean, I think some of the things the resources we were just talking about now, I mean, I think being able to have opportunities to speak with children, to ask them how they would like to process that. I think we mentioned art therapy. Some people were talking about coloring and doing those sorts of things. All there, I think some of the trick is, and some of the difficulty in that is that there may not just be one way. There are multiple ways for children to be able to process some of that. You can do that through talk therapy. You can do that through play therapy. You can do that just simply having more opportunities to get together with their friends. Now that COVID, a lot of those restrictions are becoming less and less, just giving children the opportunity to connect with their peers. A lot of times that social emotional learning piece, which is really what has been in so many ways has been put on the back burner or have kind of hit pause due to COVID. That social interaction is such a key piece. So encouraging more social interaction, seeking out ways in which our children might be able to get together and play with other children. And a lot of times that'll work itself out in that play. If there's bigger or larger concerns when it comes to that, maybe seeking professional help in that, as far as seeking a licensed therapist or a counselor on how to go about if there are worries about that. But I want to remind everybody too about the resilience of young children, about the resilience of the human. Really, I mean, it's not just young adults are amazingly resilient. I think Kerri mentioned I thought was really a great point to mention here about the positive growth that comes from a positive traumatic growth that oftentimes comes from a loss, in the ways working towards that. It takes a lot of time, and just being patient and having grace and working towards that healthier well-being can take some time. And so I want to remind everybody of that. And just trying to seek those opportunities on how I can get my children active. How can I make sure that they're doing something that's meaningful to them? And even talking about some of the art therapy, not being too shocked by some of the things that might play out, some of those emotional responses that might come out in some of that as well. Knowing that it's an outlet for them to express themselves. And so you might see anger, you might see sadness, you might see things that might feel unsettling a bit, but that can be part of the very normal process for children in processing.
Well, thank you, both Kerri and David. We appreciate all your information, the resources, suggestions, and everybody else too who participated, wrote in the chat box and had some thoughts and ideas. As there's been a couple more chats coming out, all of the series, we're looking at ways in which we can have different access to it, whether it's through podcasts, publications, information, or fact sheets. And so we'll be working on that as this series wraps up by the end of May, and talking about how we can best get additional information that covers all of this out to the counties and to our communities, because it is so important. As things come in or more questions, you know how to get a hold of us. I think our emails have been listed, and so we're always happy to answer additional questions as they might pop up too. Before